Hi everyone, my name is Evan George. I'm an MSW student at Lakehead here on the Aurelia campus, and I put together a lecture for you this week because I have some prior experience in child welfare, and I'm currently doing a master's project focused on domestic violence. So when I let Gretchen know that I have some interest in teaching in the future, she kindly let me put this lecture together for you all. And as I said, my master's project is on the topic, or on a domestic violence topic, so the fit was pretty nice. In specific, my topic for my project is co-occurring domestic violence and child maltreatment. So what I'm hoping to do today is to link some of this week's topics on domestic violence and femicide to child welfare, basically just by kind of demonstrating that domestic violence and child maltreatment do occur, and some of the factors that link to it, because we're speaking today primarily about the risk factors that underpin femicide. So I thought that would be a good way of doing this. Additionally, just to make the video files, a little bit more manageable, I think I'm going to try to do this in 10-minute bits. So hopefully that's okay with everybody watching. So I'll just check out at around the 10-minute mark and start another file. So having said all of that, let's get started. So some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today include domestic violence, emotional abuse, domestic violence with a weapon, and physical and emotional violence towards children. So just be prepared to talk about these things or hear about these things. And if I missed anything, then I apologize, but just use this kind of as a metric for the type of things that you can expect to talk about today. And a basic structure of what we'll talk about, we'll summarize the readings which are on risk factors for femicide. That's the Wilson, Johnson, Daly, and the Campbell and others papers. Then we'll briefly talk about the phenomenon of co-occurring domestic violence and parental violence, basically just to illustrate that it is something that happens, and it's well known that it happens and well documented that it happens. We'll then tie that into the risk factors for co-occurrence. This is basically the basis for what I'm going to be doing in my own work, in my master's project. And we'll talk again very briefly about the impacts of witnessing domestic violence on children and their development. So again, just very briefly, because this is that's a topic you could have a lecture series basically just on that topic, because there's a lot of research done on that. So I'll just kind of briefly touch on it, that domestic violence does have impacts on child's development. And then I put together a couple discussion questions in the hopes just of helping to focus some of your thinking on the material and help you maybe a little bit with your discussion posts for the week. So the first paper, Lethal and Non-Lethal Violence Against Wives. This is the Wilson, Johnson, and Daly paper. In essence, what they did was they compared demographic patterns of risk in lethal and non-lethal cases of violence against wives. And this was to determine if, in cases where a wife was killed, are all of the same risk factors present as in a case where there was no physical abuse, and if not, what are the differences? And this is in an effort, this is something that can help professionals understand under which circumstances a person might be most likely to be at a higher risk of femicide than others. And secondly, they were looking at whether or not controlling behaviors on the part of the husband are predictive of femicide in the same way that some of the demographic factors may be. And if they are found to be more present in cases of violent husbands, or if controlling behaviors are present or to a similar degree in nonviolent husbands as they are in violent husbands. So this is kind of a look at whether violent behaviors might be interpreted as being controlling behaviors as well. So their first finding was that wives incurred much greater risk of both lethal and non-lethal violence in common law marital relationships than in registered unions. So this is to say that there was a higher risk of both kinds of violence if they were in an unmarried relationship. So the authors interpreted this as being caused by potentially a few things. First was that men may be less secure in their proprietary claims over wives in common law relationships than in registered ones. So this is a nod to their thinking that if violence is being used as a means of control and of mate protection, then husbands would be more likely to use it when they feel like they have less control. So, for example, in cases where they are not yet husbands, so they don't have these social and legal kind of binding agreements between them and their partner. So they feel like they have less control and less proprietary claim over that person. So they're more likely to use the violence as a controlling device. They also felt that it could be that common law relationships are more common among the young and the poor, which are also correlates for higher homicide rates. So age, being younger, and lower socioeconomic status are known to be correlates for homicide rates. So they feel that if people are in common law relationships where they're more likely to be young, they're more likely to be poor, then that might contribute to a higher risk of femicide then as well under those circumstances. Another reason that they felt this finding could have occurred could be that common law relationships are more often childless, and that childlessness is associated with marital conflict and divorce, while joint offspring promote marital solidarity. And finally, stepchildren were more prevalent in common law unions than in registered unions, and stepchildren have been shown to have some correlation with intimate partner femicide. So having stepkids in the home is a risk factor for intimate partner femicide. And the second finding was that in registered relationships, the risk of lethal and non-lethal violence declined in similar fashion in relation to the wife's age. And in common law relationships, intimate partner femicide risk increased until middle age, while the rate of non-lethal violence declined. And these findings were interpreted as young women may have more options for partners. So if they have more attractiveness to potential partners by virtue of their youth, they may be shown more interest by a greater breadth of potential partners, and they're more likely to be childless and thus have no familial tie to their current partner, and they may similarly be more attracted to potential partners, therefore. So if we're talking about violence being used as a controlling device, this might contribute to a situation where an abusive partner feels like they have less proprietary claim over their partner than otherwise. And secondly, it was interpreted that young women may be in relationships with young men who are the most violent sex and age class, statistically speaking. So as women age, so do their partners or the pool from which they're selecting their partners. Thus, older women may not be engaging with younger, more potentially dangerous men, typically. And their final finding was that intimate partner femicide rates increased as the age disparity of marital partners increased in both registered and common law relationships, but there was no apparent relationship between age disparity and rates of non-lethal violence. And their interpretation of this was that it wasn't evident why they observed this finding, and that some of the factors related to and underpinning potentially this phenomena were understudied. So this was a paper that was published in 1995. So I'm not aware if there's been any developments in this area, and this might be something that Dr. Perry could speak to more than I could. So we'll move on then to the next paper, Risk Factors for Femicide in Abusive Relationships, and this is the Campbell paper. So they observed that physical violence against the victim was the primary risk factor for intimate partner femicide in their sample. So they asked what were the other risk factors within and separate from physical violence that are associated with femicide. And this was in their sample of 307 femicide cases, where 70% were found to have been physically abused before their deaths by the same intimate partner that had killed them. So some of the risk factors that they found for femicide included an abuser's lack of employment, which was the strongest socio-demographic factor, risk factor for intimate partner femicide, and the only demographic risk factor that remained significant after they added a number of different variables to their model. So that means that unemployment really had a strong relationship with femicide in a predictive way. They also found that abusers' access to a firearm was a risk factor, abusers' use of illicit drugs, abusers' high degree of controlling behavior as well was found to be a risk factor. And of interest here was that this variable was modified by whether or not the abuser and victim had separated after living together. So that is to say that if an abuser had a high degree of controlling behaviors and a victim was leaving their abuser after having lived together, they were at a much higher risk of femicide. And even to specify, they were at a 9 times higher risk of femicide if their abuser had exhibited a high degree of controlling behaviors and they were leaving that relationship after living together. They also found that the risk was increased slightly if the abuser was controlling, but there was no separation, or there was a separation and the abuser was not controlling. So that is to say that this period of time after leaving a relationship is a high risk time, and that also controlling behaviors contributed quite a bit to risk. So other factors that were related to femicide were an abuser's previous threats with a weapon and an abuser's previous threats to kill. So this is in contrast to threats outside of an intimate relationship where there isn't as strong a predictive relationship. So you think about utterances of threats outside of this context. They're really not predictive of action in the same way as they are within the context of an intimate partnership. And the abuser's use of a gun in the worst incident of abuse was found to increase risk by 41 times. Also, having been separated from an abusive partner after living together was found to be a risk factor. Again, and this again speaks to the well-known phenomena of heightened risk for violence when leaving an abusive relationship. Having a child living in the home who was not the abusive partner's biological child was also found to be a risk factor, and this expands and corroborates the findings from the previous paper that we just spoke about, pointing to the relationship between intimate partner femicide and the presence of a stepchild in the home. And when the worst incidence of abuse was triggered by the victim leaving the partner for another partner or having left the abuser for any reason, this was also found to be a risk factor. So we're just now about reaching the 15-minute mark. So I think that I'll end this video and start the next now.